What's going on, guys? Tom here, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you how to create an interaction system for our FPS game. So let's get started. Okay, so to get started I've got my FPS tutorial Godot Project open. If you don't have this already and you haven't followed through the previous two tutorials, you can either go back, watch those videos, or I will leave in the description below a link to the GitHub source so you can just go and download that and start from right where we are now. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to come into our player object in the scene view here, and we're going to click the scene icon, so we jump over into the player scene. And now you'll notice that underneath the camera here, we already have a Raycast. Now we're using that to fire weapons. We're using that as the weapon Raycast. What we're actually going to do is we're going to create a second Raycast here, and this is going to be a Raycast that determines whether or not the player is currently looking at an interactable object. To do that, we're going to click on the camera, right-click on the camera and press Add Child Node. We're going to search for a Raycast. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this one Interaction Raycast, just so that we distinguish between the weapon one. Actually, we should have called that one Weapon Raycast, just to be a bit more clear, but moving forward, we'll call this one Interaction Raycast. And what we're going to do is we're going to need to be able to detect whether or not this Raycast is actually interacting. So we're going to have to be able to detect if this interaction Raycast is colliding with an interactable object. Now to do that, I'm going to come over into my file system and I'm going to create a new folder here and I'm going to call it Interactable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new script. Now this script is going to be called interactable.gd. And all this script is going to do is it's going to be a way for us to determine whether or not an actual object is interactable. So we're going to give it a class name of interactable. Now you'll see why we're doing this in a moment. And we're going to give it two functions. The first function is going to be get interaction text. And we're just going to return interact for now. So we can leave that just as a default string. And the second function is interact itself. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to call print and we're going to say interacted with we're going to say %s, and this is just doing some string interpolation here. So we're going to say we interacted with, and what did we interact it with? Well, we interacted with the name of this current object, and that is all we're going to do for now. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come back into our player scene to this interaction Raycast, and we're going to add a script to this interaction Raycast. Now we're going to call this script interaction. Okay, so in here, what we're going to do is we are going to check whether or not we are currently colliding with an object. If we are currently colliding with an object, we're going to detect whether or not that is an interactable object using the script that we just created there. And if it is an interactable object, we're going to display some text at the bottom of the screen saying what the user can do with that object. And then we're going to also provide a mechanism for the player to actually interact with that. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to determine whether or not we have a current collider. To do that, we're going to say var current collider, and we're not going to assign anything to it right now. We're just going to leave that as a variable at the top of the script. And inside our func process method, so func process delta, what we're going to do is we're going to say var collider equals, and we're going to call a function that is on the Raycast object itself, which is called get_collider. Now, what we can say here is we can say if is colliding and collider is interactable. So what this is saying is if we are currently colliding, so is colliding is a method on the Raycast object itself, which we are extending here. So if this Raycast is colliding with an object and the collider, which we've just got here, is of type interactable, which is that script that we created before. So we know now that this Raycast is hitting an object and it's hitting an object that is marked as an interactable script. So if that is the case, then we are going to first check whether or not we already have that as the current collider. So we're going to say if current collider does not equal the collider that we just got, then what we're going to do is we're going to set the current collider to be the new collider. And then we're going to ask whether or not the player is pressing the input key. So we're going to say if input.isAction just pressed, and we're going to say interact. Now we need to quickly jump over into our project settings here. So project settings, input map, and we're just going to define a new action called interact. And we're going to say key and we're going to use the E key, which just seems to be a default in first-person games. So if the player is pressing the interact key, so E, then we're going to call collider.interact, which is that method that we had previously. So otherwise, if we say otherwise here, so elif, so if we are not colliding, so this is the else statement for this upper if here. So we're going to say elif current collider, then we're going to say current collider equals null. So what we're saying here is if we're not currently colliding with anything, then if we have a current collider, we want to null that out. So we're not looking at anything anymore, so we don't want to be holding a current collider in our variable here. And I've just noticed here that we've got 2 brackets here, so we can get rid of that and save that file. That should fix that error. Okay, so what we've got here is we're going to check whether or not we're currently looking at something and whether or not that is an interactable. And if we are, we're going to set that as the current collider, and we're also going to allow the player to interact with that by pressing the interaction key. Now, there's a few things here that we're not currently doing that I said we were going to, and that is displaying a label at the bottom of the screen to tell the player that they're actually looking at something that's interactable. So let's go and do that now. What we're going to do is we're going to jump over to our world scene. We're going to come into the 2D view, and what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on the UI element here, which we should have because we created the label for the ammo. So we're going to right-click on the UI. We're going to attach a new node. And this time, the node is basically just going to be a label. So what we're going to do is we're going to say label. And if we come here to the layout, just at the top here, what we're going to do is we're going to say bottom wide. So that's going to make it all the way across the bottom. We're just going to raise the height of this a little bit. And inside here, we're just going to say press E to interact. Now this is just some dummy text just to see what it's going to look like on the screen before we've actually set the value for this. So don't worry about what you put here. You can put anything you want. We're going to say vertical align as center and align as center as well. And that gives us a nice central aligned little label here at the bottom of the screen. We're going to change the name of it over here. And what we're going to say is we're going to call it the interaction label. And we're going to save that. The next thing we need to do is we need to come back into our script. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get a reference to that label that we just created. Now to do that, we're going to say onReady var interaction label equals, and we're just going to get a reference to that. So we're going to say get node, and then we're going to pass it a node path. Now the node path for this would be /root /world /UI /interaction label. So we've got our root, then world, UI, interaction label. Okay, and what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new function. We're going to say func set interaction text. And we're going to give that a value, which is just going to be called text. And here we're going to say, so if not text, so if we haven't passed any text, then what we want to do is we want to say interaction label. I can't spell. Interaction label dot set text. And we're just going to set it to blank. And what we're also going to do is we're going to say interaction label dot set visible false. So we're going to hide the interaction label if no text has been passed to this function. So otherwise, if we have been passed some text, we're going to say interaction label dot set text. And now what we want to do here is we want to conditionally display whatever key the project map actually has, the input map has set. So we're going to actually have to do some string formatting here, but we're also going to have to interact with some of the OS functions available in Godot. But first of all, what we're going to say is we're going to say press %s to %s. Oops, %s. There we go. We're going to say %, and we're going to pass in an array, which is the 2 strings that we want to populate here. So the first one being this one, and the second one being this. And what we're going to say here is we're going to say interact key, and the second one is going to be the text. So we're going to say press whatever the key is to, and then whatever the interaction text we've set here is. We're just going to close off that bracket. Now we're going to have to provide a value for this interact key. Now how do we do that? Well, what we do is we say var interact key equals, and then there's a cool little utility within Godot called OS. Now this gives us access to a bunch of a bunch of variables and functions available to whatever operating system the game is running on. What we can do is we can say os.get_scancode_string, and here we can pass in the input map.getActionList, and we can give it a string for the action name. So we're going to say interact. We're going to get the first value out of that, and we're going to get its scan code by saying .scancode. So this rather complex piece of code here, all we're saying basically is go to our input map, get the action that is called interact. Now it's getting that back as a list, so we're going to get an array back here. So we're saying the first one, we're only interested in the first one that's called interact. We're going to get its scan code value, and then using this os.getScanCodeString, we're going to pass that in, and that's going to give us back whatever the actual key is called. So in our instance, it's going to say press E2, and then whatever we save for the interaction text. The next thing we need to do is we need to also make sure that we set our interaction label to visible. So we say set visible to true. And that's it for this function. So the first thing we want to do is in our ready function, which we don't currently have yet, so we'll say func_ready, is we just want to set the interaction text to empty. So we're going to hide that label as soon as we load this script. Okay, so we're going to save that. The next thing we need to do is we need to check whether or not this is actually colliding with something, and if it is, we need to set the interaction text to whatever the interactable's text is. To do that, we're going to say inside here, so if current collider does not equal collider, so we've just looked at a different object, we're looking at something new now. We're going to say set interaction text, and we're going to say collider.get interaction text, which is the function we set up in the interactable script before. And what we're also going to do is we're going to call that function again once the user has interacted with an object. Now the reason we're doing this is because for things like light switches, once you've interacted with it once, we might actually want to say, turn light on, you interact with it, and then we might want it to change to say turn light off. So once we've interacted, we're just going to double check again what the interaction text for that object is, and we're just going to set that again here. So we're going to say set interaction text. I'm just going to do the same thing, collider.get interaction text. Okay, I hope all that makes sense. We'll just run through that really quickly. We're on a Raycast object. We're getting the current collision object from whatever we're colliding with. If we are colliding and that collider is an interactable object, then we're just going to check whether or not this is a different interactable object to the one we had before. If it is, we're setting the interaction text at the bottom of the screen there, and we're setting our current collider to whatever is now being collided with. We are colliding, so we're now going to check whether or not the user has pressed the interaction key. If they have, we interact with the object that we're colliding with, and we check the interaction text one more time. If we're not colliding with anything, but we do have a current collider object set at the top here, then we're not currently looking at anything, so we want to null that value out. And then the set interaction text is just setting the value for that label at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so we can test this out now. We can come into our Raycast object. So there's one final thing we actually need to do. We need to come to the interaction Raycast object, and we need to set a collision mask here. We're going to set it to layer 2 on our collision mask, and you'll see why we're doing that in a moment. We're going to save that, and then we're going to come on over to our world 3D scene. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to build a little wall here. So what I'll do is I will duplicate the ground object here. So duplicate that ground object. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, and I'm just going to shift it over ever so slightly. Oh, that's not 90 degrees at all. We want 90 degrees. Okay, so we just got this little wall here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this ground object one more time. So duplicate. I'm going to move it over slightly. And what we're going to do is we're going to come into the scale object, and we're going to change it back to 111. And I'm just going to shove this onto the wall here. Now I know everything is white, so what we can do is we can come into the material for this, create a new spatial material, click on that material here, and we can come into albedo and just change that to something like red. And that just means that we can now actually see what's going on here. So I'm going to move that down just so it's a bit more accessible by the player. And what we're going to do is I'm going to click on the ground object here. I'm going to click on the static body and its collision shape. So the static body here. I'm going to come over to the collision section under physics body, and I'm going to turn its layer to layer 2. Now what that's going to do is it's going to mean that the player can't actually hit this object. It's not going to collide with it. For things like light switches, we don't want the player to be actually physically walking into that and getting stopped, but we do want the Raycast object on the player to be able to collide with it. So we're going to set that to layer 2, and then we're going to attach the interaction script to this. So we're going to say interactable. So there's actually 2 more things that we need to do here that we completely forgot to do, and that is we need to come into the player object, we need to click on interaction Raycast, we need to enable it for starters, and we also need to change its cast2 variable to 0 on the y-axis and -2 on the z-axis. And you'll see here now that that interaction ray has appeared just out the front of the character there. You can extend that if you want to be able to interact with things that are further away, but 2 is a fairly nice value for things like light switches. And now we're going to come over and press play. We're going to walk over to our red cube, and you'll see now at the bottom of the screen here that we've got that nice press E to interact. And if we press E, you'll see at the bottom here, just in the output window, it says interacted with static body. That's great. So one thing to note is that when we walked away from the object itself, it didn't actually clear that label. Now that's easily fixed. We can come into the script here, go to the interaction script, and just where we nullify the current collider, we can also say set interaction text, and we just give that a blank string again. Press run. Now if we come on over to the square, you'll see that it comes up when we get close. It says press E to interact, and if we look away, that disappears. We look again, press E to interact, look away, it disappears. Okay, so that is how to create an interaction for an object, but how do we then use that to build something like a light switch? Now, it's relatively straightforward. What we can do is we can create a new script inside our interactable folder. Now, what I like to do is I like to have this interactable script as a base and then just inherit from that for various different sorts of interactions. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new script, and this script is going to be called interactable light switch. Okay, so we'll open that script up. Now we're going to want to do a few things here. We're going to extend not from node, but we're going to extend from interactable, and we're going to want to have in our inspector a few different variables here. So we're going to have export var light, which is going to be a node path. We want the path to a node in the current scene that is the light that we want to interact with. We want to have a variable that says whether or not it's on by default. So we're going to say true for that. We're going to export another variable here called var energy when on. So when the light is on, what's the energy value we want to assign to that? So we're just going to say 1. Energy when off, we're going to say is 0. So when it's off, we want it completely off. And then we're going to do a couple of things here. So we're going to say onReady var light node equals, and then we're just going to get the node from that light path variable that we got assigned. And we're going to create another variable onReady on equals the value of on by default. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is in our ready script, we are going to set the light energy. And now we need to define that function. So set light energy. And here what we can do is we can say light node dot set param. And here it wants to take a value which defines the parameter we want to change. Now to do that, we can say light dot param underscore energy. And then we're basically just going to assign that a value of whether or not the light is currently on. So we're going to say energy when on, if on. So this is like an inline ternary statement. It's basically an if-else statement in one single line. So what we're saying is we're going to set the value to the energy when on value, which is 1, if the on is true. Otherwise, we're going to set it to energy when off. So it's fairly straightforward. And the next thing we need to do is we need to say func interact. So we're going to override the value of that interact function within the interactable script. And here what we're just going to do is flip the value of the on variable. So we're going to say on equals not on. Basically, we're just going to flip that. And then we're going to call the set light energy function. Now the final thing to do here is to override the func get interaction text method of the interactable script. What we're going to do here is we're going to use another inline ternary. We're going to say return switch light off if on, otherwise switch light on. So if the light is on, we're going to say that the interaction text is switch light off, otherwise we're going to say switch light on. And that is basically it for creating an interactable light switch. We're going to save that, coming over to our world scene, go into the 3D scene, and now what we can do here is we can just right click on the world and we're going to add a light. So let's say a spotlight, create that. And now we've got this spotlight here. What we can do is we can rotate it. So let's say we're going to, we're just going to move it up here and across. Actually, what we can do is we can right click and add a directional light to the scene and turn the light energy down here a little bit. And also one other thing to do is we can create a world environment. So world environment, and create in fact what we can do is we can pass in the default environment.tres file here, which should be in the Godot project by default. We can drag that over to environment there, and then we can start changing some of the values here. So we can change this ambient light value, and we can just change it down a little bit so that everything's just a little bit darker. Let's say 0.5, maybe a little bit less, 0.2. Okay, so we've got a bit of a darker scene here. And then what we can do is we can come on over to our spotlight object. In fact, we can delete that directional light now. Come on over to our spotlight object, move that down a little bit. So now we can start to see it on the floor here. And what we can do is we can just stretch that out so that it's a little bit bigger. Bring it down a little bit. I'm just trying to get it to the point where it's actually obvious that the light is on. Now, this video isn't about handling lights and all that sort of thing, so it doesn't really need to be perfect, but let's just move it over here a little bit. In fact, it might be easier to see if we do something like that. That works. Okay, so then we can come into our ground 3, which is actually our light switch. So let's rename that to light switch. And on the static body here that's got the script, we're going to change the script. So click on static body, and we're going to click this little drop down arrow next to script. And we're going to say load, go to interactable light switch. And now you can see here that we've got these script variables. So on by default, yes, we want that on. Energy when on is 1, energy when off is 0. And then we can click the assign button on the light. And this is going to bring us to our scene view, and we can go all the way down to spotlight and click on that. Now actually what we could do is we could change this to on by default, and we could turn that off so that it's not going to be on by default. We'll save that script, we'll press play. And now if we look at the light switch over here, you'll see that the light isn't on. We walk over to it, we get press E to switch light on, we press E, the light comes on, and now you'll see that the text has come to press E to switch light off, press it again, the light goes off, and the text updates to switch light on. So that is our interaction script working with a light switch. And that is effectively our interaction script. So we've got a raycast coming out of the player's camera, which is detecting whether or not we are looking at an interactable object. So this square here, we've got our label at the bottom that tells the user, the player, what they're actually looking at and what they have to press to interact with that object. And we can override a interactable script to create various different interactable objects, such as the interactable light switch that you see here. You could also have things like opening doors, moving platforms, all sorts of different interactable objects there. So I hope this tutorial was useful. If it was, give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're struggling with any of this or you found it to be a little bit complicated, please just leave a comment below and I will try and help you as best I can. Also worth mentioning that I now have a Discord server. I will leave the link to that in the description below. Come on over, there's a help channel there, and if you've got any issues, I'll try and help you resolve them in the Discord itself. There's other people in that community now. We're starting to grow a little bit, so there will be people that can help you out if you are struggling with anything. Final thing to mention is I've now created a Patreon account, so if you're interested in supporting this channel, I'll leave the link in the description below, and I would really appreciate it if you'd consider becoming a Patreon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.